Macbeth. When Duncan the Meek reigned king of Scotland, there lived a great thane, or lord, called Macbeth. This Macbeth was a near kinsman to the king, and in great esteem at court for his valor and conduct in the wars, an example of which he had recently given by inflicting a terrible defeat on a rebel army assisted by the troops of Norway. The two Scottish generals, Macbeth and Banquo, were returning victorious from this great battle. Their way lay over a blasted heath, where they were stopped by the strange appearance of three figures, like women except for their beards and withered skin and wild attire, that made them look unlike any earthly creatures. Macbeth first addressed them. Seemingly offended, each laid her choppy finger upon her skinny lips in token of silence, and the first of them saluted Macbeth with the title of Thane of Glamis. The general was not a little startled to find himself known by such creatures. How much more surprised he was when the second of them followed up that salute by giving him the title of Thane of Cawdor, to which honor he had no pretensions. The third bid him, "All hail, King that shalt be hereafter." Such a prophetic greeting might well amaze him who knew that while the king's sons lived, he could not hope to succeed to the throne. Then, turning to Banquo, they pronounced him, speaking in a sort of riddle, to be lesser than Macbeth and greater, not so happy, but much happier, and prophesied that though he should never reign, yet his sons after him should be kings in Scotland. They then turned into air and vanished, by which the generals knew them to be the weird sisters or witches. While they stood pondering on the strangeness of this adventure, there arrived certain messengers from the king, who were empowered by him to confer upon Macbeth the title of Thane of Cawdor. This event, so miraculously corresponding with the prediction of the witches, astonished Macbeth, and he stood wrapped in amazement, unable to reply to the messengers. It was then that swelling hopes arose in his mind that the prediction of the third witch might in like manner come true, and that he should one day reign king of Scotland. Turning to Banquo, he said, "Do you not hope that your children shall be kings, when what the witches promised to me has so wonderfully come to pass?" "That hope," answered the general, "might incite you to aim at the throne. But oftentimes these ministers of darkness tell us truths in little things to trick us into deeds of greatest consequence." But the wicked suggestions of the witches had sunk too deep into the mind of Macbeth to allow him to attend to the warnings of the good Banquo. From that time he bent all his thoughts on how to attain the throne of Scotland. Macbeth had a wife, to whom he communicated the strange prediction of the weird sisters and its partial accomplishment. She was a bad, ambitious woman, and so long as her husband and herself could achieve greatness, she cared not much by what means. She urged the reluctant Macbeth, who felt uneasiness at the thought of blood, to carry out his plan, and continued to point out that the murder of the king was a step absolutely necessary to the fulfillment of the flattering prophecy. It happened at this time that the king, who out of royal courtesy would often visit his chief nobles in a friendly spirit, came to Macbeth's house, attended by his two sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, and a large staff of thanes and attendants, the more to honor Macbeth for the triumphal success of his wars. The castle of Macbeth was pleasantly situated, and the air about it was sweet and wholesome. The king entered well pleased with the place, and not less so with the attentions and respect of his honored hostess, Lady Macbeth. She had the art of covering treacherous schemes with smiles, and could look like the innocent flower, while she was indeed the serpent under it. The king, being tired with his journey, went early to bed, and in his room 2 grooms of his chamber, as was the custom, slept beside him. He had been unusually pleased with his reception, and had given presents before he retired to his chief officers. Among the rest, he had sent a rich diamond to Lady Macbeth in appreciation of her being a most kind hostess. Now it was the middle of the night, when over half the world nature seems dead, and wicked dreams torment the minds of men asleep, and none but the wolf and the murderer is abroad. This was the time when Lady Macbeth awoke to plot the murder of the king. She would not have undertaken a deed so offensive to her sex, except that she feared her husband's nature, that it was too full of the milk of human kindness to carry out a planned murder. She knew him to be ambitious, but still a man of conscience, and not yet prepared to undertake a major crime, to which unchecked ambition inevitably drives a man. She had won his consent to the murder, but she doubted his determination. She feared that the natural tenderness of his nature, more humane than her own, would interfere and defeat the plan. So, with her own hands armed with a dagger, she approached the king's bed. Having taken care to ply the grooms of his chambers so with wine that they slept intoxicated and were not alert to watch the king, there lay Duncan in a sound sleep after the fatigue of his journey. And as she looked at him earnestly, she saw something in his face as he slept, which resembled that of her own father, so that she had not the courage to proceed. She returned to confer with her husband. His determination had begun to weaken. He considered that there were strong reasons against the deed. In the first place, he was not only a subject, but a near kinsman to the king, and he had been his host and entertainer that day, whose duty, by the laws of hospitality, it was to shut the door against his murderers, not bear the knife himself. Then he considered how just and merciful a king this Duncan had been, how clear of offense to his subjects, how loving to his nobles, and in particular to him. He felt that such kings are the special wards of heaven, and their subjects doubly bound to revenge their deaths. Besides, by the favors of the king, Macbeth stood high in the opinion of sorts of men. And how would those honors be sustained by the reputation of so foul a murder? In these conflicts of the mind, Lady Macbeth found her husband inclining toward what was right and resolving to proceed no further. But being a woman not easily shaken from her evil purpose, she began to pour into his ears words which fired his mind with some of her own spirit, assigning reason upon reason why he should not shrink from what he had undertaken. She told him how easy the deed was, how soon it would be over, and how the action of one short night would elevate them to the throne for the rest of their lives. Then she scoffed at his change of purpose and accused him of fickleness and cowardice. Then she added how predictable. Then she added how practicable it was to lay the guilt of the deed upon the drunken, sleepy grooms. And with her brave talk, she so reproached him for his weakness that he once more summoned up courage to undertake the bloody business. So, taking the dagger in his hand, he softly stole in the dark to the room where Duncan lay. As he went, he thought he saw another dagger in the air with the handle towards him, and on the blade and at the point of it drops of blood. But when he tried to grasp at it, it was nothing but air, a mere illusion of his own hot and troubled brain and the business he had in hand. Getting rid of this fear, he entered the room of the king, whom he slew with one stroke of his dagger. Just as he had committed the murder, one of the grooms who slept in the chamber laughed in his sleep, and the other cried, "Murder!" which woke them both. But they said a short prayer. One of them said, "God bless us." The other answered, "Amen." And both went back to sleep again. Macbeth, who stood listening to them, tried to say amen when the fellow said, "God bless us." But though he had most need of a blessing, the word stuck in his throat and he could not pronounce it. Again, he thought he heard a voice which cried, "Sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep, the innocent sleep that nourishes life." Still it cried, "Sleep no more," to all the house. Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more. With such horrible thoughts, Macbeth returned to his listening wife, who began to think he had failed of his purpose, and that the deed had somehow been foiled. He came in so bewildered a state that she reproached him with his lack of fairness, and sent him to wash his hands of the blood which stained them, while she took his dagger to stain the cheeks of the grooms with blood, to make it seem their guilt. Morning came, and with it the discovery of the murder, which could not be concealed. Though Macbeth and his lady put on a great show of grief, and the proofs against the grooms, the dagger being produced against them, and their faces being smeared with blood, were sufficiently strong, yet full suspicion fell upon Macbeth, whose reasons for committing such a deed were so much stronger than such poor silly grooms could be supposed to have had. Morning came, and with it the discovery of the murder, which could not be concealed. Though Macbeth and his lady put on a great show of grief, and the proofs against the grooms, the dagger being produced against them, and their faces being smeared with blood, were sufficiently strong. Yet full suspicion fell upon Macbeth, whose reasons for committing such a deed were so much stronger than such poor silly grooms could be supposed to have. And Duncan's two sons fled. Malcolm, the eldest, sought refuge in the English court, and the youngest, Donalbain, made his escape to Ireland. The king's sons, who should have succeeded him, having thus vacated the throne, Macbeth, as the next heir, was crowned king. Thus, the prediction of the weird sisters came true to the letter. Though placed so high, Macbeth and his queen could not forget the prophecy of the weird sisters, that, though Macbeth should be king, yet not his children, but the children of Banquo should be kings after him. The thought of this, and the fact that they had stained their hands with blood and committed such great crimes only to place the descendants of Banquo upon the throne, so tormented them that they determined to put to death both Banquo and his son. To put to naught the predictions of the weird sisters, which in their own case had been so remarkably brought to pass. For this purpose they prepared a great supper, to which they invited all the chief thanes. Among the rest, with marks of special respect, Banquo and his son Fleance were invited. The way by which Banquo was to pass to the palace at night was beset by murderers appointed by Macbeth. They stabbed Banquo, but in the scuffle, Fleance escaped. From that, Fleance descended a race of monarchs who afterwards filled the Scottish throne, ending with James the Sixth of Scotland and the first of England, under whom the two crowns of England and Scotland were united. At supper, the Queen, who had a highly winning and royal manner, played the hostess so graciously that she satisfied everyone present. Macbeth talked freely with his thanes and nobles, saying that all that was honorable in the country would be under his roof if only his good friend Banquo were present. He hoped that he would merely have to reproach Banquo for neglecting to come, rather than to find to his grief that an accident had befallen him. Just at these words, the ghost of Banquo, whom he had caused to be murdered, entered the room and placed himself on the chair which Macbeth was about to occupy. Though Macbeth was a bold man and one who could have faced the devil without trembling, at this horrible sight his cheeks turned white with fear, and he stood completely unnerved, with his eyes fixed upon the ghost. His queen and all the nobles, who saw nothing but perceived him gazing, as they thought, upon an empty chair, took it for a fit of distraction. She reproached him, whispering that it was but the same fancy which had made him see the dagger in the air when he was about to kill Duncan. But Macbeth continued to see the ghost and gave no heed to all they could say. He addressed it with frenzied words, yet so meaningfully that his queen, fearing the dreadful secret would be disclosed, in great haste dismissed the guest, excusing the illness of Macbeth as a disorder he was often troubled with. To such dreadful fancies Macbeth was subject. His queen and he had their sleep afflicted with terrible dreams. The blood of Banquo troubled them less than the escape of Fleance, whom now they looked upon as father to a line of kings who should keep their descendants off the throne. With these miserable thoughts, they found no peace, and Macbeth determined once more to seek out the weird sisters and learn from them the worst. He sought them in a cave upon the heath, where they, who knew by foresight of his coming, were engaged in preparing their dreadful charms, by which they conjured up infernal spirits to reveal to them the future. Their horrid ingredients were toads, bats, and serpents, the eye of a newt, the tongue of a dog, the leg of a lizard, the wing of the night owl, the scale of a dragon, the tooth of a wolf, the maw of the ravenous salt sea shark, the mummy of a witch, the root of the poisonous hemlock, the gall of a goat, and cuts of the yew tree that roots itself in graves. All these were set to boil in a great kettle or cauldron, which, as fast as it grew too hot, was cooled by a baboon's blood. By these charms, they bound the infernal spirits to answer their questions. It was demanded of Macbeth whether he wished to have his doubts cleared up by them or by their masters, the spirits. He, not at all daunted by the dreadful ceremonies which he saw, boldly answered, "Where are they? Let me see them." And they called the spirits, which were three. The first arose in the likeness of an armed head, called to Macbeth by name, and bid him beware of the Thane of Fife. For this warning Macbeth thanked him, since Macbeth had been jealous of Macduff, the Thane of Fife. The second spirit arose in the likeness of a bloody child, and he called Macbeth by name, and bid him have no fear, but laugh in scorn at the power of man, for no one born of woman should have power to hurt him. He advised him to be bloody, bold, and resolute. "Then live, Macduff," cried the king. "What need I fear of thee? But yet I will make assurance doubly sure. Thou shalt not live, that I may tell pale-hearted feared lies, and sleep in spite of thunder." The spirit being dismissed, a third arose in the form of a child, crowned with a tree in his hand. He called Macbeth by name, and comforted him against conspiracies, saying that he should never be vanquished until the wood of Barnum to Dissenane hill should come against him. "Sweet omens, good," cried Macbeth. "Who can unfix the forest and move it from its earthbound roots? I see I shall live the usual period of man's life, and not be cut off by a violent death, but by heartthrobs, to know one thing. Tell me, if you art can tell so much, if Banquo's offspring shall ever reign in this kingdom." Here the cauldron sank into the ground, and a noise of music was heard, and 8 shadows, like kings, passed by Macbeth. Banquo came last, bearing a glass which showed the figures of many more, all bloody. Banquo smiled upon Macbeth, and pointed to them. By this Macbeth knew that these were the descendants of Banquo, who would reign after him in Scotland. Then the witches, with the sound of soft music, and with dancing, making a show of respect and welcome to Macbeth, vanished. And from this time the thoughts of Macbeth were all bloody and dreadful. The first thing he heard when he got out of the witch's cave was that Macduff, Thane of Fife, had fled to England to join the army which was forming against him under Malcolm, the eldest son of the late king, to displace Macbeth and set Malcolm, the rightful heir, upon the throne. Macbeth, stung with rage, set upon the castle of Macduff, and put his wife and children, whom the thane had left behind, to the sword, and likewise murdered all who claimed the least relationship to Macduff. These and similar acts turned his chief nobles against him. Those who could fled to join Malcolm and Macduff, who were now approaching with a powerful army, which they had raised in England. The rest secretly hoped they would win, though for fear of Macbeth they could take no active part. Recruiting for his army went on slowly. Everybody hated the tyrant. Nobody loved or honored him, but all suspected him, and he began to envy the condition of Duncan, whom he had murdered, who slept soundly in his grave, and against whom treason had done its worst. Steel nor poison, ill will at home, nor foreign levies could hurt him any longer. While these things were going on, the queen, who had been the sole partner in his wickedness, and to whom he could sometimes turn for a little comfort from those terrible dreams which afflicted them both nightly, died. It is supposed she took her own life, unable to bear the remorse of guilt and public hate. By this event he was left alone, without a soul to love or care for him, or a friend to whom he could confide his wicked plans. He grew careless of life and wished for death, but the near approach of Malcolm's army roused in him what remained of his former courage, and he determined to die, as he expressed it, with armor on his back. Besides, the hollow promises of the witches had filled him with a false confidence, and he remembered the sayings of the spirits, that none of woman born was to hurt him, and that he was never to be vanquished till Barnum Wood should come home to Dunsinane, which he thought could never be. So he shut himself up in his castle, whose strength was such that he felt it could withstand any siege. Here he sullenly waited the approach of Malcolm. One day there came a messenger to him, pale and shaking with fear, almost unable to report what he had seen. He swore that as he stood upon his watch on the hill, he looked towards Barnum, and to his thinking the wood began to move. "Liar and slave," cried Macbeth, "if you speak false, you shall hang alive upon the next tree, till you starve to death. If your tale be true, I care not if you do the same to me." For Macbeth now began to lose his courage and to doubt the deceptive speeches of the spirits. He was not to fear till Birnam Wood should come to Dunsinane, and now a wood did move. "However," said he, "if this which he vouches for be true, let us arm and out. There is no flying hence, nor staying here. I begin to be weary of the sun, and wish my life at an end." With these desperate speeches, he rushed forth upon the besiegers, who had now come up to the castle. The strange sight, which had given the messenger an idea of a wood moving, is easily explained. When the besieging army marched through the wood of Birnam, Malcolm, like a skillful general, instructed each soldier to cut down a bough and bury it before him to conceal the true size of his army. This marching of the soldiers with bows had at a distance the appearance which had frightened the messenger. Thus were the words of the Spirit brought to pass, but in a sense different from in which Macbeth had understood them. This severely shook his confidence. And now a severe skirmish took place. In this battle, Macbeth, though feebly supported by those who called themselves his friends, but who in reality hated the tyrant and favored the party of Malcolm and Macduff, fought with at least to where Macduff was fighting. Seeing Macduff, and remembering the warning of the Spirit who had counseled him to avoid Macduff above all men, he would have turned. But Macduff, who had been seeking him through the whole fight, blocked him, and a fierce fight took place. Macduff reproached him bitterly for the murder of his wife and children. Macbeth, whose soul was charged enough with blood of that family already, would still have declined the combat. But Macduff still urged him to it, calling him tyrant, murderer, hellhound, and villain. Then Macbeth remembered the words of the Spirit, how no one born of woman should hurt him. Smiling confidently, he said to Macduff, "You fight in vain, Macduff. I bear a charmed life, which must not yield to one of woman born." "Abandon hope in your charm," said Macduff, "and let that lying spirit whom you have served tell you that Macduff was never born of woman in the ordinary manner, but was untimely taken from his mother." "Accursed be the tongue which tells me so," said the trembling Macbeth, who felt his last shred of confidence give way. "And never let man in the future believe the lying treachery of witches and juggling spirits, who deceive us with words which have double meanings, and while they keep their promise literally, disappoint our hopes with a different meaning. I will not fight with you." "Then live," said the scornful Macduff. "We will make an exhibit of you, as men show monsters, and a painted board on which shall be written, 'Here men may see the tyrant.'" "Never," said Macbeth, whose courage returned with despair. "I will not live to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the curses of the rabble. Though Birnam Wood be come to Dunsinane, and you oppose to me, who was never born of woman, yet will I try the last." With these frantic words, he threw himself upon Macduff, who, after a severe struggle, in the end overcame him. Cutting off his head, he presented it to the young and lawful King Malcolm, who then took control of the government which, by the scheming of the usurper, he had so long been deprived of, and ascended the throne of Duncan the Meek, amid the acclamation of the nobles and the people.